Hey everyone, today we are going to go over the story arc. So, most stories follow the same basic pattern. We picture it to look like a shape we call an arc. These things start off normally until a problem is introduced, then the events build up until they reach the most exciting moment, and after that, everything settles back down again. Each of these parts has a name. And again, this is a pattern that you can find in just about every single story that you read. So, in the early part of the story, we get an exposition. And an exposition is the background information about the protagonist in their normal life. Because you have to remember, in a story, you start out at what is considered normal, and then you build up, you experience a conflict. You have the climax, the most exciting part of the story, and then you have the falling action and the resolution. So, where you begin is called the normal life, where you introduce a character, you get background information about the character, and learn about their life. Um, think of it as exposing the audience to a little bit of a backstory. And the protagonist, again, is the main character. So, because the narrative that you are writing right now is a personal narrative, you would be the protagonist because this story has to be about you. I think a lot of the times when we write a personal narrative, we forget that even though it's a real event and we're writing about something that happened to us, it is still a narrative. So we still have to apply narrative techniques to a personal narrative. So next we have the conflict. In the conflict, something happens that creates a problem for the protagonist. So things are going along normally, but then a conflict happens where something happens that creates a problem for the protagonist. Every story has to have some kind of conflict or problem, and this is where that starts. Next, we have the rising action. Once the problem has been introduced, we get the rising action. A lot of the times, I think people want to introduce a conflict after the rising action, but the conflict is what introduces the rising action, what happens, and then you have moments that rise up to the main event. So, once the problem has been introduced, we get the rising action, a sequence of events that happen as a result of the conflict. These usually get more intense over time. The climax is the most exciting part of the story, the turning point. This often happens near the end of the story, but not right at the end. So you're going to start out with the exposition and introduce you as the main character and as the protagonist. Then you'll introduce the conflict of your story. So what happens or what is the issue that you are writing about? Then you're going to include rising action. So what leads up to the main problem? And then the climax is the most exciting part of the story and it's the turning point. So this is the tipping point between if something is going to get worse or if something is going to finally be resolved. So this is your turning point in the story. Next, we have the falling action, the events that happen after the climax. In a lot of stories, the fallen action happens pretty quickly because the most exciting part is already over and the writer doesn't want to bore the reader. Finally, there's a resolution where the loose ends are tied up and we see how things have changed as a result of the events that happened in the story. And this follows a story and it gives examples of rising action or of the entire story arc. So let's review this. So Jordan had always been afraid of spiders. Jordan and Brian are best friends. They were hanging out. So here's our exposition. We figure out just based upon this that the protagonist is Jordan. Background information is based upon what the conflict and the climax in the story is. So we know that Jordan is afraid of spiders. So clearly the story is going to be about this, and the main conflict, rising action, and climax will be about this. And we know that they were hanging out. So this is where and what was happening when the event took place. The conflict is that they saw a spider and Brian dared Jordan to let it crawl up his leg. And we know Jordan is afraid of spiders. Rising action. Jordan said no. Brian did it first. Brian said Jordan could borrow his skateboard. Jordan let the spider crawl up his leg in order to borrow the skateboard. So this is the climax. This is the turning point. The following action. He realized that having a spider crawl on his leg wasn't so scary. So the lesson learned is to be less afraid of spiders, and that is implied. So you have a lesson learned, you have a main conflict, everything is following the story arc. So you are going to try this yourself with your own story. You should have already done the pre-writing assignment to figure out what it is that you want to write about and what the lesson learned is. Now you're going to follow this example to map out what your story is about. If you do this before you start writing your story, you should be able to have a very organized idea before you begin actually writing the rough draft. So think of this as another pre-writing assignment and use this to sequence your event so that everything makes sense and you have all of these elements of a story so that you know your readers are going to be able to follow a beginning, see a conflict, see the rising action, see a climax, falling action, and resolution.